Okay, folks, so let's really get into Photoshop. So, just like Illustrator, I would like to give you kind of a tour of the software and start working on tools just like we did last class. So, the tour is going to start in File New, okay? And what we have here is we have decisions to make, and they're going to be big decisions. So, we have the document type. So, we have all these different options here, and for the most part, we are going to work within US paper. Now, it really doesn't matter, per se, what you choose there in U.S. paper, because you only get three sizes. You get letter, which is 8.5 by 11, legal, that's 8.5 by 14, or tabloid, which is 11 by 17. You can start with one of those, and you can go ahead and swap them. Photoshop is, for lack of a better word, stupid, because I can do a tabloid, right, which is 11 inches wide by 17 inches tall, but there is not a simple, little icon here for me to turn this into landscape. So really, if I wanted to go tabloid landscape, I'd have to just type in 17, and notice when I do that, this automatically changes to custom by 11. Now, I don't like the fact that I don't have that ability to go ahead and have that 17 by 11 or that tabloid landscape. So what I make sure I do is I save that. I'm going to show you how to do that in a little bit. Resolution, okay? So resolution, this is a bit tricky, but I'm going to talk about it a lot over the course of the rest of the semester. So resolution is how many pixels we have per inch and how many pixels we have in the document altogether. So basically, for bigger images, you want a large resolution, and for smaller images, you still might want a large resolution. It's not a big gets big and a little gets little. Basically, for images that are going to end up on a screen, so things like websites, things that might be in animations, things that maybe be games in a phone or something, or things that'll go in a phone game or something like that, those will be a resolution of 72 pixels per inch, right? If you're going to print and you're going to do high quality prints, the resolution you want to work at is 300 pixels per inch. There's really not a lot in between there, okay? Can you go up higher? Can you go up to 600? Can you go up to 900? Yeah, you can. But really, most of the printers that we have access to really top out at 300 anyway. Some high-end presses, they can definitely do more. But again, what you have access to, most likely a resolution of 300 is going to be good if you're going to print. If you're not going to print, if it's going to be for web, then 72 is what you want to work with. Color mode. We have a lot of color modes that we can work with. We have bitmap, which is either going to be just black or white. Okay. Then we have grayscale, which is black, white, and the shades in between. We have RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue. Okay. We have CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And then we have this thing called LAB, or lab color, and that stands for lightness. And then channel A, channel B. What you need to know is this. In the beginning, work in RGB. RGB can work for the screen, and then we can easily convert it to CMYK. RGB has a wider color gamut, which just means that your darks can look darker and your brights can look brighter. And your colors can look a little bit more vibrant because it's produced with the light. CMYK is reproduced with toner or paint or pigment and some sort of ink, something like that. So in the beginning, we'll work in RGB. Everything will be in RGB. And then we can always convert to CMYK after the fact. And we do that even more if we get into graphics too. Next to color mode, we have these things called bits, right? And we have 1 bit, which is grayed out because that's reserved for bitmap. Then we have 8 bits, 16 bits, and 32 bits. For this class, and for probably most of the things you will do in life, 8-bit is going to be appropriate. The thing is we live in a world where bigger is better, but that is not the case so much when you get into these upper level or upper end images, simply because with what we have to work with today, our effects, our filters, things like that, they won't even work with 32-bit images sometimes. And 16-bit images limit you a lot as well. Plus, they either double or quadruple your file size. So really, you want to work with RGB 8-bit images. Background contents. You can choose white, or you can choose whatever background color is available, or you can choose transparent, which is going to give you a checkerboard background, or you can click other and you can put any kind of color there you want. I like choosing white. That is just, when I start a document, I just would like that. That makes sense to me. This stuff you may or may not see, depending on your version. If you have Creative Cloud like I do, then it's going to be right here. You can't miss it. If you have CS6 or below, there should be a little triangle there that you can click and open up your advanced options. And this is an important one, color profile, okay? We want to work with the Adobe RGB 1998 color profile. Essentially, what that is it helps us in color management when we're printing, and it's just a better profile than a lot of the other options that are there. And last but certainly not least, pixel aspect ratio. When we're dealing with graphics or photo, we deal with square pixels. When we deal with things like video, we actually deal with things like widescreen or anamorphic pixels. But since we're just doing graphics, we're going to stick with square. So these are really important. So I want to point something out. We have this thing here to save a preset. So 11 by 17 or tabloid, and I want it to be landscape. So I'm going to save my preset, and I'm going to save my resolution and my color mode and my bit depth and my background context and my profile and my pixel aspect ratio. I'm going to save all that, and I'm just going to name it tabloid landscape. And I recommend doing this for people who open up the same kind of files over and over again. And I'll say okay. And now it's in there, document type, tabloid landscape, and check it out. It's got its own little thing right there, just like US paper has its own little thing, and then it will always go to this. So if you're making the same documents over and over again, give that a try. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay. And what I have here, guys, is I've got my own blank document. And I went ahead in the last video, I made a workspace here. I'm going to go ahead and go to the Essentials workspace just so I can kind of talk about everything, and I'm going to reset those Essentials. And when I did that, a lot of stuff comes up, okay? So over here on the left, we have a toolbar, okay? And just like Illustrator, I'm going to press these two little arrows here, and I'm going to just make it a little bit shorter just so I can go ahead and see all my tools. On the right over here, we have Adobe's Doc, right? And there's all these different floating palettes, and a lot of them you're going to recognize. Things like layers, you're familiar with that. Color, you're familiar with that, although it looks a little different than you're used to seeing. If things look a little bit different, click on these three lines here, and it will give you a bunch of options. So if I go to RGB sliders, that's a lot more familiar for your Illustrator. Your swatches. There are similarities with the Illustrator swatches, but there are differences as well. Those are important things. So you're going to see some stuff like that. You're also going to see things like window and character. Okay, this looks just, I shouldn't say just, but this looks very similar to the way it does in Illustrator. Okay, maybe a little bit more compact. Paragraph is very similar to what it was like in Illustrator, okay? And you're going to find that there are other windows, other floating palettes that you are familiar with, okay? So just like when working in Illustrator, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to undock the dock. And I'm going to hit X. And I'm going to X out a bunch of stuff because I don't really need all this stuff. And I'm just going to go ahead and, again, deal with my layers and my tools. Now, before I end the video, I want to talk to you a little bit about full screen mode. So right now we are in a cascading window mode, right? And what I have is I have the ability to tap the F key, F as in Frank, and when I do that, I just change this to full screen mode. I get a couple different options. So the first one basically will remove this top layer here of these little buttons here that I can close or minimize or expand. So if I tap that F, they go away. And this is really cool. It's really important to point this out because if you recall, Illustrator had a hand tool. Well, Photoshop does too. And that hand tool we can access by clicking on the tool, or when any other tool is selected, we can hold down the space bar just like Illustrator, and then check it out, guys. We can move this around. This is like an artboard. Okay, now I'm going to zoom out so you can see that. Now that artboard or piece of paper or document, whatever you want, is just like the Illustrator one, right? And then all this stuff, right, in Illustrator, this was like the desk, and we could draw on it, right? We could write on it. Unfortunately, check this out. This piece of paper is our bounds, which means that if I go ahead and I go off the paper and I try to draw over here, nothing shows. So that's one of the differences. Okay, so we have things that are different and we have things that are the same. And this is one of those things that are different in the fact that, like, we have to, think about this where we can only draw inside of our actual piece of paper here. So that is just kind of a little bit overall kind of layout of our software. I essentially changed my essentials to my Nick Photoshop workspace. So let's go back to Nick PS demos, and there we are. There's my Photoshop workspace. My tools don't have the separation bars that they do in Illustrator. So this first group of tools, these are selection-based tools. Just like Illustrator had selections, these ones do too. Selections are huge in Photoshop. Then we start to get really into the editing tools, okay, where we can make things happen, we can build things, the creative kind of tools. Then, believe it or not, we have some vector tools, like we have like pen tools and shape tools here. And then we have some of those miscellaneous tools, things like the hand tool, things like the zoom tool, okay. You'll find that many things work the same. Some things are completely different, and then some things are kind of the same and kind of different. Then we have these three little balls here. I click, and this allows me to edit the toolbar. And you want to be careful of this, okay? Because I did this by accident one time, and I clicked on it, and all of a sudden I ended up losing most of the things that I regularly used in my toolbar. So you just got to be careful about that. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then instead of fill and stroke, we have what we call foreground color and background color. And then we have this little image of them. That's the default ones, right? So that's the letter D, and we'll get black and white, foreground and background. We can change our colors literally by clicking on them once, and it brings up this thing called a color picker. And we can go ahead and we can move all through this color cube right here, right? So we can move through this, and then we have this little hue slider, which will allow us to change the hue, where this one really focuses on the saturation and the brightness. And then we can change our hue to something else. And to make the color happen, we can just say, okay. We can also, if we have something like the color window open, I can click on it here. And I can move these things around, and I can change the background color that way. If I ever want to swap background and foreground, I can just go ahead and hit this little arrow that switches them, or I can tap the letter X on my keyboard, and that will swap the colors. Swatches we use here in Illustrator, but probably not as much, in Photoshop, but probably not as much as we did in Illustrator. What we have is we have a palette that has a ton of swatches on it by default. These are just all basic swatches. And then up here what we have, these are most recently used colors, and this is actually nice. And so like these ones here, they were used in previous documents, not even the document I'm working on. And so like we can bring back colors that I might have used 2 weeks ago, which is pretty cool. Okay, depending on how often you change your foreground and background color. As you can see, a lot of mine are black and white, and it's because I use black and white a lot when I'm working in Photoshop, and you'll see why in the future. So if you want, you can go ahead and when you make a color, if you really like it, you can add it to swatches too, and you can give it a name. So I can just say Nick's green and say okay, and then it'll show up there, and it'll be called Nick's green. And right now it's saving it to my Creative Cloud library. Actually, I'm going to hit cancel, and I'm not going to add it to my library because sometimes it takes a while to connect to the internet. So I'll just say okay, and now I'll just say okay here and check it out. There's Nick's green. When I roll over it, it should say that Nick's green versus dark green cyan versus 80% gray, light violet magenta. You'll notice that these actually have names instead of like the C50, M20, thing that you saw, the formulas guide that you saw earlier in Illustrator. So these actually have some names. So that's just a basic overall kind of just quick snapshot of this. When we come back, we're going to take a look at layers, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more than I did in that previous video where I was kind of goofing off a little bit. And then we're going to talk about actually utilizing some tools and starting to edit some photos. All right, thank you.